In this video, I want to go through a quick PowerPoint type presentation on how to do a big city skyline. You may have seen that I've done other videos on this sort of topic. However, this is a step-by-step process without actual drawing. This is all graphics. The first couple of slides will be review. This is your picture plane, the edges of your paper, your window on the world. Next, since this is going to be a bird's eye view, we're going to set our horizon high. This is your eye level. Then we're going to place a vanishing point on that horizon line somewhere towards the center of the page. That way we'll have less warpage towards the edges of our picture plane. Next, we're going to start our picture by placing several rectangles that go off the bottom of the page. They overlap, and the ones on the sides go off the sides of the page as well. All of these are placed below the horizon line, below our eye level. Please note that you should never use a pen at this stage. This should all be in pencil. If you wish to at the end, you may go over your pencil lines that you're going to keep with pen, but at this point, it's just as important what you draw as what you erase, and pen will not erase well. As many rectangles can be made as one wants. In this case, I made 5. It seems to work very well. I have placed them all below the horizon line, and I have left no gaps between them. Since these will be the fronts of our buildings, now we will choose which ones will be closer to us and which ones farther away. We will erase the parts that are farther away behind the other building fronts. We now have a very basic elevation view of several buildings, one in front of another. But this is not linear perspective at this point. This is all flat. To make this a linear perspective drawing, we will need to use that vanishing point, which is on our horizon line. So we're going to draw lines from the top corners of each of these box shapes, each of these rectangles, back to the vanishing point. Next, we will decide on each of these box shapes that are going to be buildings, how far back we wish to cut them off on the top level of the building. I normally look at each of these boxes and cut them about 1/6 or 1/5 of the way back along the lines of perspective. I can cut them farther off back there, but if the buildings get too big, they won't be very believable. Please note that all of these lines on the back end of the building match the lines on the front end of the building. Since the front end of each of these boxes is horizontal, the back end of each of these boxes is horizontal. Next, we will find the inside corners of those horizontal lines that we just made and drop vertical lines matching the vertical lines on the front of the boxes for each of those, giving them a three-dimensional appearance. This then becomes a very good time to clean up all of the stuff that we no longer need, to look at what overlaps and should be seen and what is overlapped and should be erased. We then use vertical and horizontal lines to create window shapes on the fronts of the buildings. Next, we drop lines of perspective on the sides of the buildings to create window shapes on the sides. Please note once again, these are not random angles. All lines going back in space go back to the vanishing point. There are no exceptions. This is another good point to clean it all up. We now have our first row of buildings. And we will now repeat with the second row of buildings. Please notice that our steps are primarily the same. The only difference is the first row of buildings are covering over the bottoms of the second row. We drop the same lines of perspective as we did before. We use the same horizontal lines to cut off the backs of our buildings, just like the previous steps. The same goes for our vertical cutoffs. We put those in, matching them up with the horizontal cutoffs. We clean up the lines that aren't supposed to show because of overlapping. We use vertical and horizontal lines to put windows on the fronts of the buildings. And then we add more rows behind. Notice that some of these in this row are going to go above the horizon line. Remember, if the top is above the horizon line, we won't see down on top of it. That's the main difference. The farther back in space, the less detail we can see, so there's no need to add windows to the far back buildings. We can even lighten up those lines back there to make it look like things fade out in the distance. The horizon has been made choppy and uneven to give it sort of a rolling hills effect. Notice that things get lighter in the background and more firm and dark with more detail in the foreground. I will finish up here with the normal criteria that I would have as part of an assignment. You can see that I would have a minimum of 10 buildings in this one-point perspective, all of them overlapping in some way. The closest buildings should have windows on all the visible sides and then fade that out as it goes back into the distance. And for an extra challenge, you can see some of my other videos, putting boxes on the tops of buildings and working things into the tops and sides of buildings to make them more interesting is always a good way to make your picture unique and special.